Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar hosted by Medical Alley, our one-click patient experience conversation. I'm Jody Hubler. I'm going to be your moderator. I am Vice Chair of Medical Alley. I'm also on the board of Bind Benefits and a number of other local venture-backed businesses here in the Twin Cities community. I am excited to share this hour with you to navigate and help us move through. One of the areas for you to note, chat will be moderated. Please feel free to ask your questions of panelists, to put in any additional comments, and I will weave those into our dialogue and our discussion today. But I am excited to share this hour with our guests, and we'll start with a group of introductions. Allie, would you please kick us off with some introductions?
Hello, I'm looking forward to the conversation today. I'm Allie Wing, and I have spent the bulk of my career really at the intersection of the consumer and technology. I've done it across multiple industries, the majority of my time in consumer products and in consumer services or direct-to-consumer and omni-channel retail. About 3 years ago, I joined all of you and entered healthcare. I've also done it sort of up and down the chain of size of companies, from Fortune 500 Nike to startups like Giggle and Bright Health. So that context sort of gives you the lens that I'm going to bring to this conversation today, which is really a deep experience in customer-centric digital transformation, plus a little bit of experience in healthcare and very fresh eyes, but a strong desire to see healthcare become more consumer-friendly.
Awesome. Thank you. Hi, Kathy.
Hi, I'm Kathy Parsons. I'm the Vice President of Population Health at CentraCare, which is an organization, a provider organization across central Minnesota and southwest Minnesota. We serve a metro area, smaller metro area, as well as we provide 40% of the rural healthcare in all of Minnesota. I've spent my career in healthcare and primarily here, and have come out of the finance side of healthcare. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I took over population health, which, as all of you likely know, involves outcomes, care, pay for outcomes and value, which includes the patient experience. So I have a strong interest in how the patients experience healthcare, which I know historically has been clumsy and in person.
Thanks, Kathy. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Fraser, and I'm the head of finance for Capsule, and we are a digital pharmacy that is transforming how folks engage with pharmacy through their experience and designing better experiences. And I bring maybe a hybrid of Kathy and Allie's background, coming from the finance side of the world for a number of years as an investor, looking at many different types of opportunities across a range of industries, to the startup world where design and experience is at the core of everything we do when we are creating for the consumer. So bringing the finance side and the consumer design side together to look at things through a lens of, similar to Kathy, how do we use design to drive outcomes? And that at Capsule, we're starting with the pharmacy. So the pharmacy has been my entry point into healthcare, and what that really means holistically for the healthcare ecosystem, as we set out to do so.
Fantastic. Well, thank you to the three of you at the outset for joining us. I look forward to sharing this next hour with you. Allie, let's get started with you. As you shared, you come to this conversation today with a background seasoned in that customer-centric, very digital savvy transformation. So set the stage for the audience. What exactly are we talking about when we speak to and about experience design? It can take on various forms and fashions. And then what do you see as the biggest CX or UX, so user experience or customer experience lessons learned from other industries about that customer transformation that can be applied to healthcare?
For sure. Experience design, is really, it's a broad concept, and it's really defining the process that teams use to create product, really to create a meaningful experience for a target audience that has been defined. at its truest sense, it can be the definition of the corporate strategy, the reason for the company to exist. But it can be as broad as building the reason for the company's existence to as narrow as a particular tool in an application that's on a website. So there's a range. What it shares in common, I think, in all times is it's both form and function, and it is a design process. So I think that's sort of the grounding of the what. There are a lot of lessons, I think, at this point that have been learned across industries, but I guess I thought about the question and I thought, I'll call it the 4 that I think are the big ones that I've seen across the industries I've been in. And I would say, as a general rule, experience design almost always ends up concluding that less is more. And I always listen, it's the hardest work to get to the simplest answer. And that's true in experience design. And I would say that's kind of a universal truth. I would say the second is great experience design can't serve multiple masters. So know who you're designing for, and understand how to get from what is always a multi-audience objective to designs that are going to be optimized for the most that you can optimize them for. I would say third, user design in its best definition, broad or narrow, is never one and done. You design to build and iterate and test and learn and rinse and repeat. And that's the very definition of it. So it's not a big bang initiative. It's an over time and incremental process. And then last but not least, and I give an example on this, is that data is your best friend. The beauty of the current platforms today is that we learn usually a lot more from people monitoring people's behaviors and what that tells us than when we ask them what they think of things. My favorite example, and it was one of my educational experiences with going into healthcare, was to understand how CMS asks health plans through surveys of consumers if they're happy with their service. Now, at the simplest level, I'll just tell you, what's the definition of service? Does anybody know? Might be a ton of different ways somebody answers that. I can tell you that both Amazon and Nordstrom think they've won the business model on service, and nobody would think they're the same service. So monitoring the behaviors of consumers' interactions with your product or service is probably going to tell you a ton more than answering that question.
Thank you, Allie. I think that helps us ground at a macro level. Sarah, in your introduction, you spoke specifically to Capsule's business model in pharmacy. And while, not often the case that you're designing for one or that it is a one and done big aha moment, it definitely was an aha moment that burst Capsule, that frustration that came out of a bad pharmacy experience. The essence of design sometimes is birthed in those moments, or that question of what just happened and why. So what's been the role of technology in your efforts to improve patient experience, and how essential is cutting edge tech in what you're doing?
Yeah, we often think about broadly the digitization of consumer verticals in 3 stages, the last of which is, occupied by healthcare and a couple of other industries. But the first stage of digitization was your Amazons and your e-commerce sites, where you could go to lampshades.com and get lampshades, and wrenches.com and get wrenches. Very easy products to put online to understand for consumers to engage with digitally. And over time, you saw the next stage of kind of the digitization and e-commerce verticals move towards the branded development, the Warby Parkers and the Harrys owning kind of the full end-to-end journey and components of it. And today we find ourselves, I think, in that third stage, which is really, left for healthcare, real estate, and financial services, which really required a blend of technology and human elements coming together to really create that experience, because these are all very high trust categories for consumers. And so as part of building our pharmacy experience and how we have approached the use of technology, we really are seeking to blend technology with humans to create a very high trust, frictionless consumer experience. And so we on our end have rebuilt all the back end of the pharmacy using cutting edge technology so that I can send you a checkout link for your prescription, within 60 seconds of getting the prescription from your doctor, enable price transparency, let you chat with a pharmacist, all of those very great technology advancements. But we've also married that with human touches. We still answer every chat with a real pharmacist. We put elements into our operation that are very human in nature on the customer service side of things, and making sure that we're there for you as a consumer. And so bringing that all together, I would say that the role of technology has been, enabling us to create an experience that brings together both human and technological elements in a very delightful way for consumers.
Thank you, Sarah. And I know we're going to come back and unpack some more of that. Kathy, we've already had a leading question from one of our participants that just tees right up into the voice that I know you're going to bring to our conversation today. And the grounding that while all this innovation is taking place and all the promise of what's possible is being funded, we still have some fundamental issues of basic access in our rural communities. Can you share with us how the rural systems are both, on the one hand, invigorated, yet also challenged by the opportunity for experience design and improving our healthcare ecosystem?
Sure. I think a lot of people are aware that as the pandemic took off, one of the first things we needed to do, and certainly in Minnesota, where we shut off in-person everything for a period of time, was something healthcare has never been known to do, which is stand up video visits within, 48 hours. But what we quickly discovered, and while that's great for our rural areas, if they have digital access, if they have broadband. So actually one of the first meetings I was on as part of the incident command was trying to work on a proposal related to broadband coverage, better broadband coverage in our rural areas, because for many people, that was really the core of what they needed. Then there's also speaking to the digital literacy that came across in that question. That's true in both rural areas and in more metro areas where there's that gap. And there's sometimes, though not always, an age gap of digital literacy. And we discovered we spent a lot of time, for example, on the phone, talking somebody through how to get hooked up. So there's a lot of things in rural that are great. If we can stop people from having to drive 35 miles to come in for a visit that doesn't need to be in person, win for the patient, win for the provider. But, they got to be able to do it. And so we discovered a challenge there. And I can tell you that post the surges in COVID, we saw it drop back down, and we saw a lot of people, we offer them a video visit and they're like, nope, I got to come in. That fear factor of it's not going to work, and then I'm going to miss my appointment and it'll be another 2 months before I get another one. So we have a lot of work to do in that space of making it, and you're back to the point of one click, but it's always one click after you get into the system, at least with our system anyway. So I think we still have challenges, very significant ones, both rural and we'll get to in a little bit more of the challenges for people who have been historically underserved. And of course, if we look at gaps in care, rural has it, and then in metro areas, poorer populations, refugees, and we have a large refugee population where we are as well. And the things we learned from COVID, it really taught us many things, probably many things that people in those groups already knew, that healthcare was blind to, but looking for ways to say, how do we make this work for people, not just the middle mass, but everybody? That's a challenge we now have, and we've laid in front of ourselves so that when we look at something, we say, who does this serve? And who doesn't it serve, and why, and can it be modified? I did like your comment, Allie, about, things have to serve. You can't serve many masters. And the one thing healthcare does is try and serve 10 masters every single time.
Yeah. So let's transition to you, Allie, again. And, Sarah tees up the technology and the opportunity, and Kathy speaks to the tension acutely in what we're dealing with. So at the crux of design, there is that question of how to leverage the middle, right? Not overly leading, not overly lagging. There's, in our org design, we talk about sometimes not crossing that fine line of weirdness where the system rejects. So I'm curious, when we come back to design principles, then that speaks to issues of segmentation. So why is segmentation such an important part of good UX and of the design? And then why is testing so important? Can you take us into those two subjects, please?
I think Kathy just gave us the perfect illustration and reminder that there is no one customer, but there is a temptation in today's world to be very lured by the sexiness of one-to-one personalization. And the practical reality of that, even for the most sophisticated platforms or businesses today, they're not good at one-to-one yet. And there's an operating reality that I think is best solved in the middle with segmentation. And that's really the role segmentation ends up playing. And the example I would give you is, if you were, let's say we were designing a provider finder and helping people figure out how to match to doctors, and you had 100 people you were designing it for, there's not really probably 100 unique, discrete ways that they're going to think about how to do that. But there's probably a half a dozen, and they're ranked very differently if I took those hundreds and divided them into affinity groups. And understanding that is the sort of what I would say practical way to get on the road with good. You then sort of leads to your second question, which is, why is testing important? Is really, when you're building experience design, it's a lot like financial forecasting. You start with some insights and assumptions, like maybe those 100 people, we identified 6 groups. But then the only real guarantee you have is your forecast is wrong, right? It's part wrong. So now you start testing and learning against those 6 groups. And that's where this idea of testing becomes so fundamental. Segmentation gets you on the road. Testing and a complete rinse and repeat around test, learn, measure, iterate, repeat really gets you to great with those options. And that combination is uniquely enabled in today's digital platforms, and probably the thing that makes it so exciting for us to design today versus 20 years ago or 10 years ago.
Well, and Sarah, you guys are sitting right at the mix of that in the access to underserved communities and multi-user, from physician to pharmacist to, multi-patient experience. And so can you speak to us and share with us how you've taken on that multi-user perspective, why it's important in healthcare innovation, particularly how you've attacked that at Capsule, and then kind of the evolution of that patient experience across all patient demographics?
Yeah, from kind of the multi-user perspective, I think as we built the pharmacy platform at Capsule, we've really invested in understanding how Kathy uses the pharmacy and how physicians use the pharmacy and how hospitals use the pharmacy, and what that engagement looks like and what outcomes they're really trying to drive, and how can we use the pharmacy to help achieve those. We were on a call, the 4 of us, a week ago, and Allie reminded me that, the goal is not that people are on 8 medications that they get all the time. The goal is that they're on 2 medications that they get all the time. And we 100% agree with that. So how can we make sure that as doctors are writing medications, they have a communication pathway back to the patient to say, hey, stop taking this, keep taking this one, change it here, and really create those feedback loops of information on what's going on with the treatment so that we can get to a better outcome. And so understanding all the different users of the pharmacy and using that to inform how we create experiences and when and where should we be intervening, which gets to the second question, and how should we be intervening based on the demographic of the patient? Is that a phone call? Is that sending a nurse to the house to check in on someone? Is that a ping in the app? Depending on the person. I think the way that we have built our platform is to try to make it multimodal so that folks can engage with it however however they are able to engage in person, on the phone, analog, digital, to really ensure kind of that broader access, but then also to take the information from the rest of the users of the system to understand those patients and what they need and when interventions are needed and how we can surface those. Maybe it's not a call from the pharmacy, but it's a ping back to the doctor to say, so-and-so hasn't picked up their meds and they're not responding to our text, your nurse needs to reach out. So really being thoughtful about how we understand the users and then the patient demos on the back end to create the interventions.
Thank you. Kathy, bring the provider perspective back to this for us. I'm curious, as you've talked through, not only is it just fundamentally identifying where there are barriers, we know that there's a significant amount of intention, but the reality is that providers are uniquely positioned to face some specific challenges to their ecosystem that are unique and different than other segments. Some of those are regulatory, sometimes it's impacts to social determinants, sometimes it's infrastructure and systems. So can you unpack it a little bit more for us about the uniqueness of the provider experience? And then also how do you see physicians and systems working through those items together with innovators, and what is important here?
Yep. Sure can. So there's a few different things and as we talked last week, we managed to get in our own way pretty successfully sometimes, and regulatory and pricing helps us too get, that gets in the way. So all change is adaptive. As far as a provider is concerned, any change usually involves some change in how they function. And they've had an awful lot over the last couple of years thrown at them. And so they have fatigue, adaptation fatigue. Now I have to do what? Now I have to connect how? That type of thing. So that's one challenge that we have of ourselves. How do we do that? Then we think of payment systems, how physician compensation works and how it doesn't work. And it doesn't work, if a new technology comes along that doesn't result in some version of pay for, a provider is less inclined, to utilize it. Right now, we're still operating under the emergency powers that allow all of the video visits to be covered, and they will be for a while, but that needs to stay if you're going to have providers uptake that and keep it. Because if they're not paid that way and their physician comp model is paid by that widget idea, we have a problem. So there's a problem we have to solve there. As I think of social determinants, some of us are lucky enough that the only things we're worried about is, am I eating right, getting enough fruits and vegetables? But the real biggest challenge to being healthy for people is, are they poor? Your zip code. Do you have availability for food? Not even which foods are you eating, but do you even have availability? Social determinants can get in the way, and if you lack literacy, in some of the technology or lack access, as we heard over this last year, how many people were sitting outside of a Starbucks to do their schoolwork, let alone anything else. It has become a clear differentiator between the haves and have-nots of who can access the various technologies and how they can utilize them to advance their health, their education, whatever it is. And we'll continue to see that be true unless we nationally think through how are we going to tackle that. So there's a lot of different ways we get in our own way or other things get in our way. And I think working with technology, the innovators, how can we talk about those? How can we talk about both the adaptation piece that would impact a provider, regulatory or payment issues, and frequently those payment issues are across all of the different payers. Sometimes, at least in our state, Medicaid does a better job of covering some things than some of the commercial payers, because employers might be more reluctant to pay for those if they have a longer term benefit versus the short. And then, in the world of social determinants or access, we have a challenge with access, and we have a challenge with equity once people get access. And so I think it is that working together, asking those questions, and not just of the likes of me, but also of those people in those groups that are historically underserved. How do we get their voice at the table? Because when we got their voice at the table early in the pandemic, one night were on a Zoom call with 500 Somali folks. And they were asking questions. How do I do X or Y? Or my employer's saying this, is it true about COVID? And boy, asking them what their challenges were made us quickly change documents, change processes. It was incredible what we didn't know because we sit in a different place. So I think really getting the voice of people is really important.
So Kathy, a question has come in from the audience. And again, I will encourage those of you that are on the webinar, we are monitoring the chat, or you can also send in to me from a facilitator perspective. So Kathy, want to interject with a question that has come in around the payment component of the technologies. Many of the entrepreneurs in our ecosystem are creating new forms of technologies that can enable that one-click experience, but they hear the challenges about payment model and what others view as an easy. In Allie's prior world, if you create a Nike tennis shoe and you sell it, you know who's going to buy it, you know who's going to pay for it, how much it's going to cost, and there's a bit of a straight line processing. So, can you talk about how technologies get paid for, and is there a tension between benefiting the patient, whether that's a refugee, a rural community, underserved community, and who actually is paying? So could you just educate our audience quick about how the payment models work?
Sure. So most, but not all, new technologies aren't separately paid for. They are something that you add on because it's good. Now, that's not entirely true. There are technologies that actually come with a payment, but most don't. And so from a provider perspective, we have to look at them if we don't get a pay for the actual use of it, how do we get a benefit from it, a financial benefit from value-based contracts? And of course, people are at different levels. So you might talk to a provider who's like deep into value-based care, and they'd say, yes, that actually helps us achieve the outcome we want. And you might talk to another one who's like, no, we're not going down that road. And I would say that's more true in rural areas because they can't take that kind of risk. And then there's no payment for it. So unless the payor, the insurance company, hops in and says, yes, this is worthwhile, and finds a way to fund it. And I can think of an example on remote monitoring where someone was trying to sell it to me as a provider, saying this remote monitoring would be great. And it was very expensive. And their model had been built upon actually being able to apply this to thousands and thousands of people. Sorry.
No worries.
Boom. Thousands of people. And that works when you're a payor, and it doesn't work when you're a provider because we don't have thousands who need it in the same way. So I think that, and we've had conversations with them since saying, let's help think through what would work. And I think those are the kinds of challenges we face because there isn't always, certainly not quickly, payment models move slowly. There's not always payment that comes with the per click, if you will. And so it's got to have a different kind of value proposition to it that we need to think through. And sometimes there is and sometimes there isn't, but it's kind of digging into that.
Sarah, putting you on the spot for just a minute, the question also came in around Capsule's business model and just wanting to understand that how the innovation and the one-click experience that Capsule's creating, how you were able to overcome revenue barriers and how you were able to introduce Capsule in a way that could be of financial benefit as a business as well.
Yeah, we own the full stack. And so one of the ways, we make money just like every other pharmacy on the street corners make money. And the margins are thin, but there is just enough margin there for us. We have, invested heavily in our engineering and product resources to build technology and have taken venture funding along the way to help us get there. As with most things in healthcare, you really need scale to drive all elements of your your financial model. And so we are still driving at that scale. But the core unit economics of our business, from folks filling prescriptions and delivering them to doors, does make sense. We have really we operate out of a single facility in each market that we serve. And then that, single location operation helps us to cut down on a lot of the rent and other working capital costs that many pharmacies face from having multiple locations, but are able to leverage the technology to serve a very broad, wide service area from each location, so that we get the benefits of being able to scale out of that location.
Thank you. And putting a plug in, Minneapolis is one of those markets as well.
Minneapolis is one of our very first markets outside of New York, and have really had a great experience with the folks in Minneapolis, lots of demand, and have expanded our service areas actually quite rapidly since we launched last March, thanks to the demand from folks in Minneapolis. So very excited to be in Minneapolis.
Awesome. Allie, you, another question that came in regarding to that segmentation, what can innovators do or show a healthcare client to push them to invest in segmentation or persona research before jumping into that product design? So one last question, then we'll come back to some more of our content and then a few more questions. But can you help give some insight into your experience on what people can do to help really focus on that investment in segmentation and persona research versus just jumping right into product design?
I would say the biggest opportunity, and this isn't actually unique to healthcare, I still see it in every industry, but it's exacerbated in healthcare, is to sell the value of product design processes through engagement initiatives or a variety of digital KPIs that nobody can tie back to the financials. So the most important bridge, I think, to cross is to understand what drives that business's performance, and then actually build metrics of your product performance, because segmentation will give you better product performance, that are understandable at the P&L level. And I think that's a great weakness. Historically, it was the early weakness in the consumer, sort of the CPG or the consumer brand or the retail industries, and figuring out how to do that. They've sort of learned their lessons at this point and built that into it. And in healthcare, you still see that earlier stage where nobody really argues that the idea sounds right, but you can kind of drive a truck through the metrics that people are using. And there's a lot of talk about the importance of things, but not a lot of measurement after it goes live. So you really don't know what's going on with the activation and how that's changing your business. Without closing that door, you're not going to change the decision makers. And I think you'll have a low success rate in selling in, whether it's segmentation or any part of experience design.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to stay with you for a minute, and then we'll invite Kathy and Sarah to chime in on the same question. One of my favorite examples recently around UX and design principles being brought in was a vaccine distribution center in the Southeast that town contacted the general manager of a Chick-fil-A because they were receiving disproportionate number of long lines and wasted vaccinations based on time and being able to create. So they brought the leader of a Chick-fil-A in to help navigate the design of how they were conveying and creating weight. So you talk about multi-industry coming in to help, which have been maniacally focused on the consumer experience and design theory in the way that they're doing a drive-through to create a differentiated experience. So with your multi-industry perspective in healthcare, what role do you see the role of consumer, and then this notion of consumer-driven healthcare and shaping the future of healthcare experience and engagement?
Healthcare is expensive, no matter what table you're on. And frankly, you could argue not affordable long-term the way it is currently structured. And where consumers have become the most savvy over the last 20 years is exercising their right through price and transparency. And I continue, and they've been well trained at this point, right? They're trading stocks with a different kind of transparency. They're buying houses with a different transparency. They're buying all sorts of products, and some of them arguably complex products, right? Now with a different type of transparency. So there is a sort of pent up demand that is, I think, putting pressure on healthcare. And I will be the last person in the group probably to say that I don't still think it's very opaque in healthcare. My 3 years in only tells me that much more, that unpacking the layers of how do you get at that transparency is very complicated. But if I look at where consumer transformation has occurred at the highest rates, its core driving orientation has usually come from dollars and cents and transparency of buying and selling. And that's where I think you're going to continue to see transformation, the earliest, the fastest, the biggest. And it's one of the reasons why Sarah can speak to this a ton better than I can, but it's why we're seeing it in things like pharmacy earlier, because it's a product exchange that's going on. So you can get at it. So the behaviors being learned in other industries are showing up there faster. It gets a lot harder when you're having somebody talk about the price to help you with general health. And those are less transactional feeling. But that's where I really think consumers aren't going to let up and pressure's only going to increase. And that's where the innovation will come from.
Right. Sarah, how about you? What's the role of consumer experience, the consumer-driven healthcare in shaping experience and engagement?
Yeah, I think, similar to what Allie was saying on transparency, and as we can move from interactions like pharmacy or specific acute care moments, which perhaps are a little bit easier to price, it's how we make it easy for the consumer, which is obviously what brings us here today, one click. And how do we move through a process where things are more and more one click for consumers, because we know that if we make it easy for them to do, they will do more of what we want them to do. So if we want to make it easier for them to go to wellness visits so that they stay better and don't need kind of the downstream healthcare to help us save costs, and we need to create very easy to use wellness experiences. And so the more that we can, see how and learn from our consumers on how are they engaging with their healthcare, as Kathy said, and then how do we design for that and navigate the complexities that the regulated nature of healthcare has thus far made hard to make everything truly one click yet, but the technologies are getting better, that the systems are upgrading. And so the more we can do to remove the friction of access along the way for the consumer, I think the more that they will use it and we can get to the outcomes that we're seeking.
Kathy, again, back to your unique perspective, where do you see as the role of consumer-driven healthcare shaping the future?
I think it is a combination. I agree. Transparency and pricing is an issue, though I would say that the more recent legislation that said hospitals publish a charge master is of zero help to the average consumer. I know what I'm doing with it, and it's not terribly helpful. And the ones who really know are actually the health plans, and I know that's in the works. But so it is that, but it is also, and we've found this over and over, price matters. But when it comes to their healthcare, they might go, price matters, but I think I'm getting better quality going here versus there. And that might not even be just to a particular doctor. I brought a group of local CFOs into a meeting. And I said, okay, you have a bad cough. Where should you go? And they said, well, the emergency room. No, expensive place to go. Don't do it. But their thought was, well, they'll get to it faster, not recognizing that the emergency doctors are not necessarily going to get there faster, and there are cheaper places to get their care. So there's a combination of this mindset people have of cost, but also a mindset of where do I think in my very not professional view, I'm going to get the best care. And if they don't already have an appointment, they don't think to go, maybe there's one available today, because there usually is, so they either end up in an urgent care or an ER. And then if we get to rural, they'll say, no, the cow's got to be milked later today. I'm just not going in at all, until that becomes a mess. So there is a human element in this different than if I need to pick up something and it's clear to me what it costs and I'm, they're lined up together and there I can say, oh, I'm going to pick this one, that type of thing. So I think we still see that human element impacting differently. And I do believe in price transparency. And I do believe it would be great for patients to understand better the cost. And yet, they still have this feeling of this is my life and my body, and I'm not going to take any chances.
Yeah, Kathy, you mentioned the quick clinics, and it's been interesting even just in over our time of Minute Clinic being founded and established here, that there's a generation that has come up that are now viewing Minute Clinic as laggard, right? The instantaneous doctors on demand or the true one click that on my phone I can dial for a doctor or create those one click relationships and patient relationships that we have. So I'm curious from all of you as we're kind of closing out on our panel, we hear right? We hear Amazon coming in. We hear a number of others, Apple and its use of technology coming into the ecosystem. Even the quotes of your margin is our mission with those opportunities. So the COVID year has definitely exposed a number of things, but it's also accelerated. It's compressed time to market in a number of different areas. So across all of you, and Sarah, let's start with you first. What do you see and what are you watching from your vantage point as some of the key trends in healthcare experience that you see and expect to play out over the next 5 years?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're seeing across the board and we'll see more of is personalization throughout healthcare, so that we're surfacing the right experiences to folks. And I think building some of what Kathy said, and I think what's lacking is a trusted source, trust and credibility for the consumer with the broader healthcare ecosystem. Who am I supposed to ask about? Where should I go for my cough? Where do I find that information? And the more that we can do to build trusted relationships, maybe through engagement, the more the consumer is engaging with us, either the pharmacy or the insurer, the more that they will grow to trust us. And then we can really build better and smarter experiences for them. That is a virtuous cycle that, allows them to trust us more. And so I think as we look forward, the more that we will see an emphasis on kind of personalized experiences, and hitting on the other points, kind of more transparency, more one click to make it easier for folks to kind of use those experiences.
Okay. Kathy, what's your take?
Well, I agree with Sarah that really is, how do we make it easy? It's interesting, as the pandemic began, we have a platform that does asynchronous e-visits. And we said, if you have respiratory symptoms, it's free. And we saw thousands of people go to that site. Now that site provides all sorts of other care. And we thought, well, maybe that people will have it. We'll see an uptake on those other things as well, for which there's a cost, but not a big one. Nope. They like the free version, but still they kept coming back to, but I need to see my provider. And we really thought we would see this opened it more. It was probably the best advertising we could have is, hey, we got a free one you could go in there for, but we didn't see that growth in the same way that we expected. And trying to get to the bottom of that, why? What makes people think and these are all things I use it. These are all things that, that it can only cover certain things that you could easily use an asynchronous, it's a quick process. People didn't uptake. So I do think we need to, it's back to that human element and how do we get to that and figure out the why behind the lack of uptake on some of these, because great things that we should be doing.
Allie, why don't you close out for us, both on what you see as some of the trends, but also just as you bring about the multi-industry perspective, healthcare's laggard a bit. So integrating your perspective on the future, given what you know about other industries and other segments.
I think I have so much respect for the complexity that is being discussed in all of this, because there is this issue of sort of who has the interest for a longitudinal enough view with the relationship of the consumer such that we can do personalization that isn't just around specific transactions. And I'm dubious that inside healthcare alone, we're structured to have that view, to drive that sort of their economic lifetime value isn't really rewarded on a multi-year basis in most of the systems that I observe. So I tend to lean into my optimism at the intersection of industries that are pushing up against healthcare, because I think the incentive structures within healthcare aren't going to produce the fastest innovation. I think it's going to come at the intersection. I'll give you a couple examples. I think what we're seeing from CPG and technology in the space of femtech and what's happening with what's been this age-old gap around women, our understanding of women in medicine, is some of the most exciting innovation we're seeing. And it's very much with healthcare participating, but it's because it's a mashup of three industries that are forcing that change. That's a big, exciting area for me where I get really enthusiastic about where we're going to see bigger innovation and bigger steps sooner. I would say another area, and this was, Sarah knows I feel passionate about this, about the number of prescriptions out there today, but food as medicine is another exciting area. And it's, I would argue, where CPG, who's, by the way, consumers are holding their feet to the fire on what is our food today. And they're pushing pressure against pharma and healthcare because those things are all related. And I think there's really interesting innovation happening there because at the end of the day, the macro trend of the average person over 65 on 6 to 7 prescriptions is kind of a path to nowhere for us when we look at our looming healthcare costs. So I do think it's difficult, given the very regulated nature of healthcare, which doesn't really act with a lot of the normal market forces. It's not like when you get more choice, prices are going down. That's not a general rule that we're observing in healthcare, and that's unique because it is a quasi-free market. That I think it's going to take the mashup of industries, and I get most excited on the borders.
Awesome. Well, Allie, Sarah, Kathy, thank you for giving your time today and your perspectives to this subject. We've only just touched the surface of what's possible in the user experience, but hearing your perspectives about the multi-segments, the implications across all of them, and the what's possible when we bring in that intelligent design. And in fact, when we extrapolate from other industries that have gone before us in this area, I think we all remain hopeful and somewhat excited about what is to come and what's possible in healthcare. So to all of our participants today, thank you. And to our panelists, thank you very much for spending time with us today.